Hey everyone, congratulations. We've made it to week 3 of English 302. And what I wanted to do today was to talk about the next step in rhetoric and argument. I wanted to today talk about fallacies. So we know that rhetoric uses logos, pathos, ethos, but there's one way that rhetoric separates itself from an argument. And that is that rhetoric will always use fallacies. So I think it's important that we just kind of briefly talk about what fallacies are. Now, sometimes I think that students sometimes hear the word fallacy and they panic. They think fallacies are hard or they're complicated, but in many cases, fallacies are really easy to identify. Some of them are silly, some of them are just plain up dumb, and then some of them are kind of interesting. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of give you a definition of fallacy. So my definition of a fallacy is false logic. Most students hear the word fallacy, and even if they don't know what a fallacy is, they can associate something that is false when it comes to being a fallacy. So if you think about it, if you accept my definition of rhetoric, and as of week 3, I'm still going to maintain my definition of rhetoric, which is words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. But if you accept my definition of rhetoric for a second, and you go out in the real world and you come across someone using rhetoric, and you hear them use a fallacy, right? You hear that person saying something that's false. What happens is your brain slows down and you start to critically think. Because once you recognize that someone is using a fallacy, rhetoric will have less of an impact on you. So in our textbook, chapter 5 deals with fallacies. So you're going to want to look over, and I believe there are 17 fallacies in our textbook. And I'm just going to name 3 of my favorite fallacies. And then I'm going to name 3 fallacies that I find really kind of interesting. So one of the most popular fallacies that I always like is I like the ad hominem. And an ad hominem is a fallacy that when you attack a person's character rather than addressing the issue. So when you attack a person's character rather than addressing the issue at large. So I always like to think of the angry student who just hates me and stands up and says, "Don't take Professor Gutowski for English 302. He's just like Saddam Hussein. Don't take Professor Gutowski for English 302. He's just like Hitler. Don't take Professor Gutowski. He's a real son of a bitch." Notice that's a great example of an ad hominem. It's a great example of someone that's attacking my character rather than dealing with the issue. Notice that imaginary student didn't say, "Don't take Professor Gutowski, he's a really bad online instructor," or "Don't take Professor Gutowski, he requires you to do a lot of work," right? So I always like the ad hominem because, you know, it's silly. It's when you attack a person's character rather than dealing with an issue at large. The other fallacy I find interesting is a non sequitur. And a non sequitur is when you take 2 things that have absolutely nothing in common and try to associate them together. So again, if we were to use an analogy of our English 302 class, you know, someone might come into class and say, "Hey, don't take Professor Gutowski's English 302 class, it's just like Auschwitz. Don't take Professor Gutowski's English 302 class, it's just like Dachau. Don't take Professor Gutowski's English 302, it's like being trapped in a concentration camp." And again, notice this is a non sequitur because notice it's comparing 2 things that have absolutely nothing in common, right? Our class and a concentration camp have nothing in common. And again, the reason why I think I like these 2 fallacies is because I see them used all the time, right? We see that anytime in politics someone doesn't like something, they refer to him as Hitler. Or we see oftentimes people try to compare things to Auschwitz. And so I like these 2 fallacies because they're pretty easy to identify. In some cases, they're silly, or you just have to wonder why people make such bizarre comparisons. Now, the other fallacy, it's one of the fallacies that I think is really easy, is the bandwagon. I think bandwagon is really easy because it's pretty simple. Everyone else is doing it, why aren't you? Right? Bandwagon works very much like peer pressure, right? Again, if you're taking an imaginary student, you might say everyone's taking Professor Gutowski's English 302 class, why aren't you? So you have 3 fallacies that I like, which are the ad hominem, an attack on a person's character, the non sequitur, when you associate two things that have nothing in common, and the bandwagon. However, I'm going to tell you three other fallacies that intrigue me. And those three fallacies that intrigue me are dogmatism, equivocation, and paralipsis. And what I want you to do is I want you to look in our textbook, and I want you to look over these fallacies, and I want you to kind of come up in a discussion board why you think these three fallacies are the ones that I find most interesting. So I'm going to add a discussion board based on our fallacies, and as we kind of go throughout the next couple of weeks, we'll kind of play around with fallacies. Notice in many cases, some of them are very easy, some of them are pretty stupid, and then I like the fallacies that are a little more challenging, that force critical thinking. So I'll look forward to what you have to say in this week's discussion board, and then I think what we're going to move on afterwards is we'll start to get into specific arguments. I'm trying to get us to look at two specific arguments. One is stasis theory, and the other is the Hegelian argument, and we're going to try to wrap up Into the Wild in the next 2 weeks. So I look forward to seeing what you have to say, and then we will keep going and seeing how class goes.